Okay, everyone, so I'm Veronica Pedrosa. Some of you may know me from my television career. I used to be at CNN and at Al Jazeera English, and I'm very honored and grateful to have been asked to participate and moderate this high-level dialogue, leaving no one behind at the global platform on disaster risk reduction. I'm very happy also, for the first time, to be working with someone who is signing what I'm saying. I think that's a fantastic step forward. I wanted to speak about a couple of housekeeping notes before we go on to introduce our esteemed panelists. They are to do with technical matters, because we would like to use technology to have you participate as much as possible in the discussion we're about to have. After all, it is about inclusivity. If you go to the app, which I'm sure you've all downloaded, and to the event that we are doing at the moment, you will see that after the list of the panelists, there are some, where are we? There's a list of our speakers, then there's a kind of summary of what the panel discussion is going to be about. And then there are some sort of turquoise buttons. The first one says poll, who should be responsible? And I'd really appreciate it if you would use that button to answer the question that you will find revealed when you push it. The second button says click here to ask a question, because in the latter part of this session, we will be taking questions from the audience via the app. So this is your chance to take part in what is really a crucial event in the effort towards reducing risk from disasters. So rather than going through the bios, which you can see for yourselves in the programs and on the websites, what I've decided to do is to ask our panelists for a thought, just a brief thought, to introduce themselves as they go into it, and I'll read them for you. To my immediate left is Mr. Alhaj As-Si. He's Secretary General of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, also known as the IFRC. He says, we can never understand the vulnerabilities and capacities of communities unless we actually work with those communities in advance of any crisis. Hence the vital importance of local humanitarian actors based in the communities who are of the community. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you. To Mr. Alhaj's left, we have from Ecuador, Alexandra Ocles. She is National Secretary of Risk Management for Ecuador. And she said inclusion, compromise, and responsibility in disaster risk management are fundamental pillars for the attention to priority groups, to strengthen the capabilities of our citizens, their communities, and nationalities is the best path to create cities and countries that are more resilient. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Ocles. To Ms. Ocles' left is Carrie-Anne Eiffel. She's President of the Caribbean Council for the Blind and former President of the Senate of Barbados. She says, disasters do not discriminate, and neither should we. In preparing to address the impact a disaster has on any community, all efforts must include measures that are inclusive. Very well said, and thank you very much indeed, Senator Eiffel. To her left, we have Nela Canales. She's a research fellow of the Stockholm Environment Institute. And she says, defining the most vulnerable defining the most vulnerable for financial targeting is more difficult than what it seems. Innovative solutions are required with partnerships with the private sector, but the role of the public sector will remain critical in the design and implementation of such solutions. And last but definitely not least, we have Mr. Mohamed Beyavogui. He's Director General and United Nations Assistant Secretary General. Oh, I should mention, that's wrong, Director General of ARC. He says, to achieve sustainable and inclusive responses to disaster risks, development aid resources should support governments' budgets in financing innovative mechanisms such as risk transfer and leverage resources from the private sector, for example, insurance or bonds for better resilience. Now, I've already had a bit of a debate over insurance with some of our panelists, so I think that's going to be one of the points of interest as we go forward. Nevertheless, leaving no one behind, investing in local action and empowering those most at risk. This global platform is a key opportunity to move the policy conversation at the global level to better integrate climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and adaptation policy investment and programming. It's a crucial opportunity to scale up action to create concrete change for vulnerable people. Despite global commitments to leave no one behind, those most affected and vulnerable are not receiving the assistance they need. Older persons, for example, people with disabilities, women, poor and socially marginalized people with lack of access to information, decision-making structures, resources and social justice are disproportionately affected by hazards. Displaced persons also live in disaster-prone areas often, and global investment in adaptation, risk reduction, and preparedness is not prioritizing these people. It often fails to reach vulnerable communities at the local level where the need is greatest. As the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies has found in its 2018 World Disasters Report, millions are being left behind.
Over the last 10 years, 2 billion people have had their lives turned upside down by disasters. We are making progress in reducing disaster impacts, and overall, deaths are going down. But our prevention efforts are still leaving millions behind. Why? Poverty. People in the poorest countries are 7 times more likely to be killed by a natural hazard. But international funding for disaster risk reduction and preparedness is not going to the countries most at risk. Many poor and marginalized communities live in legal limbo, left off the map, lacking identity documents, and forgotten when we build our risk reduction programs. We focus our attention on the national level, on the most populated and developed areas, and the people in remote and hard-to-reach locations are left out. We know that older people and people with disabilities are more likely to die in a disaster than others. People who don't speak the official language often miss our warnings. We are still not doing what it takes to prepare for their special needs. We need to change. Change how and where we invest our resources. Focus on the most vulnerable. In our programs, our plans, our laws, and our policies. We need to make those furthest behind our top priority.
And thank you very much indeed to the IFRC for putting that video together at the last minute. really fantastic job by the people there. And appropriately, of course, their Secretary General is here to discuss the findings of the World Disaster Report and this idea of leaving no one behind, to help us understand what's happening and why, to set out the problem, before we go on for the rest of the discussion to talk about the solutions. So I'd like to ask you, I've budgeted 15 minutes here. I'm sure you could talk for even longer, but I hope that what we can do is also include other panelists and make this a bit more of a conversation about what your experiences have all been about what the problem is with people being left behind. Thank you very much, Secretary General.
Thank you very much. I think when we look at a video like this, we see a lot of shocks, hazards. We see a lot of destruction. But at the end of the day, it's really not about that. It's about people. People, their lives, people, their livelihood, people, their livestock, people, their ways of lives, and most importantly, people and their dignity. And in shocks and hazards like this, people lose a lot that we can see. But we should never allow that they lose what is most important to them, and that is most important to each of us, which is our human dignity. And that focus on people and their dignity, will force us, of course, to go beyond, what is easy, to go beyond the average, and then to dig down there where the needs are greatest, where people face, the multiple deprivations, and make sure that what we call the last mile in our analysis become a first mile in our response. When we talk about change, and then we need to change, what the key message there, it is about, of course, preserving many of the gains that we have been making so far over the years in responding to shocks and hazards, but not satisfy ourselves with those gains, but then use it as a baseline, as a platform upon which we can even build better and strive, for excellence. And there are some key elements there that I just would like to share in kicking this discussion off. It is very difficult and sometimes even impossible, deep in the middle of a crisis, to build the partnerships that are required, the trust that is required in order to make a difference in the lives of so many. Being there before is critical. Being there during is critical. And it is also critical to be there after. So a continuous presence, to engage continuously with the communities is key. In the same spirit of continuum, we also should not just wait until the shock and hazard hit, because when we do, it will be too late for too many. We should not accept that every shock and hazard become a disaster. We are not helpless in the front of shocks and hazards. Early alert, early warning, early action. And when we respond, then we make sure that we invest in those communities the capacities that are required, so that next time around, when the same shock and hazard happen, people will be able to withstand, those shocks. We should change also in the way we measure even the progress and the results. Year in, year out, in same places, same types of shocks, 50,000 people in need. The next year, we think we do even better by covering the need of 70,000 people. And again, the third year, 100,000 people. Well, if you would like to see, progress in the coverage, of the need, maybe. But in terms of capacity to withstand, we should ask ourselves, what did we do the first time we responded, so that the next time we have the same shock, we have less than 50,000 people in need. So the change should be, again, to put ourselves into a continuum of a presence and also a continuum of a response, and to recognize and validate those that are living in those communities, because it starts when we don't want to leave anyone behind. It starts with recognizing even the existence of those people, physically where they live, recognition in their identity, recognition in the different abilities they have, and recognition also in their knowledge and their capacity that we can build on, to work on. Because, and this is my last comment in the introduction, it doesn't matter how early, how fast we are on a disaster scene, and they call us all the first responders, the fast responders, but it doesn't matter how blitz-fast you are, you find always people there before you trying, to respond, sharing their wisdom, sharing their last grain, sharing their last loaf of bread, and also the poorest of the poor, taking care of their neighbors. Building on that, will be the key. It is going also to be the key in recognizing local action and recognizing local actors in that sense, and that's what we in the Red Cross and Red Crescent commit and pledge, to put into that overall response. Thank you.
It's wonderful to hear an actual commitment like that coming from such an influential organization as the IFRC. I just wanted to follow up with one brief question, which is, which of the reasons for why people are left behind escapes the most attention, do you think?
It all depends, on the different contexts. Sometimes people are left behind because they don't want to be seen. If being seen is a threat, to your safety and your security, like this migrant who's been dubbed, as an illegal. And by the way, there's nothing like an illegal human being, but that is how they are dubbed, and then characterized for. And they also would like to go underground, so they will not be seen. If people, have to line up and then present an ID card in order, to get the supplies or the aid that is needed, and they don't have that ID card. So their whole life is reduced with that small piece of paper, and then they will not be then identified. If people have to rush, to the scene, to get very fast, what is being distributed, but then their motricity is challenged, or because of age or because of other conditions, they will not be seen. So to make sure that in each of the contexts, we map out what are those type of vulnerabilities and bottlenecks that people are facing, and start removing them, and then reach out. And that's where, again, the last mile become the first mile, to identify those in those different contexts and make sure that they are prioritized.
Thanks very much. I'm going to just take a couple of minutes to ask whether any of our other panelists wanted to weigh in and talk about their experiences of what the problem is with people being left behind. We did have a preliminary chat a bit earlier in the morning, and I remember one of you was talking about somebody who went in to try and save their brother, but was not able to, or their cousin, but was not able to. Yes, I think that was you. Carrie Ann.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, for me, I think one of the major challenges why people are being left behind is because there's not enough forethought about how do we prepare for persons with disabilities. The incident that Veronica was referring to was in the tsunami in Japan, where a wheelchair user, he was a quadriplegic, and he decided to die because it was too much trouble to remove his equipment. And his cousin, who had gone to save him, had to leave him because there was no way to be able to remove him and all the equipment that was required. Forethought, planning ahead of time, understanding the situations that may occur. Too often we wait and see what happens afterwards, and then those that are most vulnerable, as our colleague said, are forgotten. They can't get to the stations, they can't get to the places where they need to be to get the aid that is available. And other people trample over them, and they're just forgotten. And so I think awareness and education is one of the biggest areas that needs to be given attention before the shocks and the hazards strike.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much indeed, Carrie-Anne. I've just come back from Bangladesh, from Cox's Bazar, helping save the children with their efforts with the Rohingya refugee crisis. And I came across a child who not only had cerebral palsy, but was suffering from severe acute malnutrition, and the whole community is trying to get ready for the monsoon season. And it's just, this awful sort of accumulation of vulnerabilities in that case. Did you want to say something? No. Yes, please.
I just want to reflect on this issue of it doesn't matter how fast we arrive there. And I think it also reflects the need of not only permanent presence of international organizations, but also to strengthen the people and the institutions that are already there, already acting, already responding. And that's when that disaster risk reduction takes place. So it's not only about responding fast, it's about how to make all the institutions that are before the international organizations to be strong and to be active in disaster risk reduction.
Definitely.
Thanks very much, Nella. And with that, we can move on to our interactive part of our poll. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I don't know if everyone was here. If you've got the app, there is a chance for you to weigh in at this point. Who should be responsible for taking the lead on making sure that no one is left behind? We gave you 3 choices. Those are the results. Apparently, most of you think that governments should take the lead, communities second, and donors last. Please, this is not going to shut, is it? No. So you can, everyone, and we can continue we can check on this again. Why don't we do that? Why don't we check on it at the end of the session to see whether there's any change in that balance after this discussion? I think that might be quite an interesting exercise. Right. Let's move on to the second part of the discussion. And as we do, can I just acknowledge that we've already had 2 changes in our signing experts. You're working hard. What's your name?
Cindy.
Cindy is joining us now. Thank you, Cindy. So, as I've introduced earlier, Alexandra Ocles, National Secretary of Risk Management of Ecuador, is joining us because we do want to talk in this second part of the discussion about what an inclusive, effective multi-stakeholder process looks like. What are the key roles taken by stakeholders and member states to ensure it. Ecuador is a particularly interesting country when it comes to inclusivity, because as many of you will know, the Ecuadorian president Moreno was shot in 1998 in a robbery attempt and thereafter has used a wheelchair. So for his advocacy for people with disabilities, he was actually nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. And when he assumed office in 2017, he became the world's only currently serving head of state to use a wheelchair. He's actually been appointed as Special Envoy on Disability and Accessibility by the United Nations Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon. During his first year in the office of Vice President, he investigated the state of disabled people in Ecuador. At the time, the government's entire budget for disabled services was approximately $100,000 US. He increased the budget for disabled people more than 50-fold. perhaps more importantly, rights for disabled people were introduced in laws passed in 2007 and 2012 and in the 2008 Constitution that empowered Ecuador's disabled. Measures included in 2010 required companies with over 25 employees to have at least 4% of their staff people with disabilities. So I understand that this idea of inclusivity is extremely, is mainstreamed really in Ecuadorian policy, isn't it? But in disaster risk reduction, and for you personally, Alexandra, there are other groups that you have been working with to try and make sure that we reach this kind of environment that we've been talking about, an enabling environment. Alexandra is going to be speaking in Spanish, so for those of you who don't speak Spanish, you might want to put your headphones on.
Muchas gracias, buenas tardes con todos, con todas. Siempre es un gusto poder compartir las experiencias de cada uno de nuestros países y de lo que está sucediendo en torno a distintos aspectos. Y en el caso de Ecuador, como bien se mencionaba, creo que hay avances importantes que han permitido precisamente poder generar una política pública que tiene sentido, sí y solo sí, es integral y permite que en su aplicación y en todo el ciclo de ejecución de la política pública podamos construir intersectorialidad, es decir, que podamos generar sinergias con las demás instituciones del Estado, con las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, para que efectivamente esas políticas puedan aterrizar en sujetos concretos. En este sentido también, en el caso de la gestión de riesgos, confesamos que ha sido un reto poder repensar en nuestra institucionalidad y poder sin duda ir construyendo poco a poco una serie de mecanismos que permitan efectivamente no dejar a nadie atrás. Por un lado están las personas con discapacidad, por otro lado también hemos pensado en los pueblos y nacionalidades, asumiendo que nuestro país constitucionalmente se afirma como un Estado plurinacional e intercultural, por tanto, la población indígena, el pueblo afroecuatoriano, el pueblo montubio, también tiene que ser considerado desde su propia cosmovisión. Comentaba en alguno de los foros pasados que nosotros logramos por primera vez en el país construir un plan familiar de emergencia en lenguaje ancestral, en una lengua quichua que tiene que ver con una población específica del país.
I just wanted to ask about how you build trust among these communities that don't necessarily trust each other, and who takes the lead on that?
Hay un tema que para nosotros ha sido importante y es el ejemplo del presidente de la República. El presidente ha marcado en cada uno de sus colaboradores la necesidad de ponerse en los zapatos del otro. Cuando uno logra ponerse en los zapatos del otro y entender que esa otra persona que pertenece a un grupo de atención prioritaria o que históricamente ha sido discriminado, no tiene las mismas condiciones que podemos tener la gran mayoría de personas, significa entonces que al pensar en la política pública, que al pensar en los mecanismos o en protocolos, es fundamental que podamos generar esta sinergia que permite garantizar los derechos de las personas con discapacidad, en este caso, o con las personas de atención prioritaria tal como las define nuestra Constitución. Hablo precisamente de las mujeres, de los niños, niñas y adolescentes, que son grupos a veces doble o triplemente vulnerados. Pero sin duda en el marco de la gestión de riesgos, como decía, hemos hecho este esfuerzo de ponernos en los zapatos del otro y de poder entonces generar una serie de protocolos, de guías, en el caso de la instalación de los albergues temporales, que permiten poder tomar en cuenta estas especificidades. Sigue siendo un reto. No hemos logrado solventar quizás todas las necesidades que la población, en este caso con discapacidad, puede tener, pero creemos que el mismo proceso que significó a lo largo de estos años poder identificar dónde están, poder tener una base de datos, saber claramente cuál es el nivel y la categoría o la clase de discapacidad que tienen las personas, hizo que sus familias y esas mismas personas puedan tener una nueva confianza en el Estado, en su gobierno y confiar en que las políticas, los mecanismos, las normas que hemos generado a lo largo de estos años simple y llanamente están garantizando los derechos de esas personas.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I wondered whether anyone else in the panel would like to comment on what Alexandra's had to say, if they have any examples from their own experience, because I know that there is a lot of experience across the panel. Mohammed, we haven't heard from you yet. What do you think an enabling environment looks like for inclusivity?
Yeah. I come from a continent where 60% of the population live in rural areas. And out of those 60%, at least more than half live below the poverty line. But paradoxically, these are the same people who produce up to 30% of the GDP, thanks to agriculture. And despite all statistics, they produce 80% of the food that is ate in Africa. But they live below the poverty line. They are left behind with the economic growth, development. Infrastructure does not allow access to these people. And when disaster strikes, drought, flood, cyclones, they are the first to be affected. And they are affected because they don't have the right shelter, they don't have the right facilities. Sometimes they don't even have the right information. Competing priorities in front of government makes public resources to be allocated to health, education, things that are tangible and in front of you. And you don't usually give priority to what may come or may not come. So that's why we really should pay attention to those people and help them to be prepared, to be assisted in terms of appropriate responses in good time. So at this point, I will stop here.
Thank you very much for responding to my to my request there. Just wanted to hear your voice from the other side of the panel and keep it conversational. By the way, everyone, you may have seen up on the screen on this big monitor, these are the questions that are coming in via the app. As I mentioned earlier, you can click a button and ask a question that I'll put to the panel towards the end of the discussion. And I think you can vote on them, you can like them. See, yeah. Do you see the top one's got 7 likes? So you're more likely to get your question asked if you can get your friends to like your things more, like your question more. Anyway, for now, let's move on to the third part of the discussion, which I think we've all mentioned in different ways already, and that's about the legal and policy solutions that might exist. And I'm going to turn to you, Carrie-Anne Eiffel, for this. And I wonder, as a former parliamentarian, what elements do you think need to be in place so that legislative work is aligned for inclusive disaster risk reduction?
Thank you very much. I'll just step back first before we go down the legislative framework and stick to what I was saying earlier about the importance of education. In those cultures where we have less democratic approaches to things, we have examples where persons, whether they want to or not, they're evacuated. They are taken away, they are given no option on whether they can stay at home in the event of a disaster. Now that works in those cultures, but it does not work in the more democratic societies where we are more inclined to respect on the, sorry about that, where we are inclined to respect more the civil rights and the human rights of the individual. So I think that a large part of any legal policy needs to incorporate heavily on education and awareness. That being said, I do, as governments develop their policies for disaster risk reduction and mitigation and all of the gamut of stuff that needs to be worked on with disasters, we need to ensure that it is inclusive, that we demand, for example, Jamaica recently established their inclusive policy on disasters, where several of their shelters and their programs that go out into the public have to address the needs of persons with disabilities. So they make sure that they have sign language, or at least they try. 17%, which is up from 0%, which I think is a good thing. They also incorporate making sure that shelters are accessible and that plans are put in place ahead of time for how persons will get there. Makes no sense making the shelters accessible if the correct transportation is not put in place. So for me, when a government is examining its policies, it's not just about the disasters, it's about ensuring that across the board their policies speak to inclusion. If they're building new schools, make sure that the schools will have an accessible approach. If you are expanding your transportation service to the public, make sure that your transportation service is accessible, because these are the resources that are going to be called on in the event of a disaster to move people around. And if they're accessible, then you're not, running around looking afterwards, how am I going to get that person in a wheelchair out? What systems do I put in place to reach the deaf and hearing impaired? And of course, as we try to bridge the digital divide, that is another avenue. At home, the government is working on digitizing Barbados. And one of the things that they are doing is ensuring that as they approach a digital system for everything, that they make sure that they bridge the gap for elderly persons and persons with disabilities so that they can access the information in formats that make sense and that speak to them. And that way, when the disaster strikes, it's not going to be testing a new system. It's going to already be in place. These are some of the legal frameworks that need to be in place. It's not just about the disasters. It's about ensuring everything is inclusive upfront so that when everything needs to go into the pot to deal with disasters, that it's already in place.
Thanks very much. Carrie-Anne, I wondered whether you could, or anyone else on the panel, could describe a success story or a concrete example on a legal and policy solution. I think it always helps to be very specific with these kind of things. I don't know whether you can think of anything.
En el caso de Ecuador, a partir de la aprobación de la ley para las personas con discapacidad, uno de los aspectos en los cuales no habían sido incluidas históricamente era en el sector laboral. Por tanto, hoy todas las empresas y todas las instituciones públicas o privadas deben incorporar aproximadamente el 4% de su personal debe ser completado con personas con discapacidad. Eso obviamente ha generado toda una dinámica a la interna de las instituciones para poder convertirlas en instituciones mucho más accesibles y ha permitido también poder generar otra visión sobre las personas con discapacidad, pero también otra interacción entre los distintos funcionarios o el personal de la empresa o de la institución.
And I think, Carrie-Anne, you wanted to mention something as well?
Yes. At home in Barbados, we have a policy set up where we've established what we call a Vulnerable Persons Committee. Now, this committee is tasked with identifying persons who would be most vulnerable in the event of disasters. That committee goes around, they update their database to make sure that they know who lives where, what's going on with that person, do they have resources, do they have somewhere to go in the event of. And then they go to the shelters nearest to them, make sure that they're accessible. They put systems in place for transportation. They share information. They're working towards an inclusive approach for the hearing impaired so that all disaster warnings, all information is made accessible. And I think that an approach like that, yes, it works on a small island, but built out in different ways can work in larger contexts as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that the issue of small islands, because I think that they have a really, I don't want to say peculiar, as if it was something strange, but there are very specific problems for small islands. As if, for those in the audience who may not be aware, do you want to talk a little bit about that, also in the context of climate change, Carrie-Anne?
Well, let's take the hurricane season that we experienced 2 years ago. We had devastating hurricanes sweeping across the Caribbean. Antigua and Barbuda is a twin island state in the Caribbean, and one of their two islands was completely devastated when, I think it was Hurricane Irma, passed. And so persons had to be evacuated. Some of them said, no, these are our homes, we don't want to leave, but all the homes were devastated, and the Prime Minister said, right, we're just taking everybody irregardless because the storm is projected to pass this way again. And so they took everybody out, and that is why small islands, we don't have the resources. Some of us, especially those that are called middle-income countries, we're not even recipients in the end of a lot of aid. And when we are hit, we are very hard hit. Our infrastructure is very well built up. But with climate change, we've seen upsurges in the amount of hurricanes, in the level of devastation that they are bringing. And so where you used to have a situation where a few things were devastated, now an entire island can be completely wiped out. And to this day, I don't think many places have been restored. Dominica, for example, was extremely damaged during the hurricane, and as of last check, 40% of their household stock is still under repair from 2 years ago.
Thank you very much, Carrie-Anne. That was really graphically described. And I think it's a good way to segue into Nella's research for the Stockholm Environment Institute, because I think, Nella, your research has been based in climate change, but it is relevant to disaster risk reduction in terms of innovative financial solutions that are out there to support those most at risk.
Yes, as a climate analyst focused on adaptation, what we share between the climate change and the disaster risk reduction community is the policy aim to attend the needs of the most vulnerable. But I also have to say that in practice, both communities struggle to deliver funding to this group. However, this challenge has fostered the use of innovation for solutions, including financial instruments. One of these innovative financial solutions that has become very popular, and we will hear more about this, is index-based insurance. And index-based insurance for climate risk has been promoted to deliver on two objectives. One, to generate adaptation in vulnerable populations, but also while doing this while mobilizing private finance. In our research, we found that...
Sorry, Nella,
yes.
Did you say space insurance? I couldn't...
Index-based. Index-based.
Index-based, because
Yes.
they've written it as...
Oh, no, index-based insurance, which is insurance that delivers their payouts based on an index that is linked to, in this case, to a weather-related event.
What index is it based on?
It depends on the hazard. What we have most experience in is droughts.
Thank you.
Yes, rain as well, related to droughts. All right. So what we found in this index-based insurance research is that this instrument has been successful in mobilizing funding, but it has been more successful in mobilizing funding from the public rather than from the private sector yet. And whereas private sector has been, in fact, engaged, this engagement has required further resources from the public sector, especially when the main intention was to target the most vulnerable. And reaching the most vulnerable will still require significant support from the public sector, and not just for developing the market. In fact, even when insurance markets are developed, public resources and funding will still be required. For example, if a country wants to be part of a sovereign insurance scheme, as for drought, for example, as those ones are offered through the African risk capacity, that Mohammed will tell us more about later, they need to purchase a premium. And this premium so far has ranged between $1.4 million for Mauritania, up to $9 million for Kenya. And this has to be done every year for every rain cycle. So in these cases with ARC, funding has come entirely or mostly from countries' budgets. And even when countries have received support for financing parts of the premiums, this funding has mostly come from donor support. This means from international publicly funded programs, which is also public funding. So even though this is international at this time, it remains public. So I just want to emphasize that even with these innovative approaches that involve partnerships between public and private actors, public funding remains key. And we also found that business models for non-sovereign index-based insurance, and this means that are the ones that where the policyholder is not the government, are also attractive and are attracting a diversity of private actors, including insurance companies, insurance brokers, aggregators of smallholder farmers like cooperatives, or even agricultural input providers. But these business models, whereas addressing the needs of vulnerable populations like smallholder farmers, would mostly target those that are less vulnerable among the vulnerable, such as those smallholder farmers that are already linked to markets, for example. So this is not necessarily wrong or even surprising, because private sector actors need to have a business case for getting involved. However, it reaffirms that when targeting the most vulnerable, the role of public sector remains key.
Thanks very much. Did you see Mohammed just pointed at me because he wanted immediately to step into to what you were saying? And maybe also you could explain a bit more about how index-based insurance works. Because, okay, so you pay, like you were saying, Kenya pays a $9 million premium. What for? For how much? And it seems to me like an extremely small amount for a country of its size, and both economically, geographically, et cetera,
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to support her research. So, no, I raise my hand because ARC is a vivid example of the use of index-based insurance. Africa decided in 2012 to create a specialized agency to support the governments in disaster risk management and financing, and that is ARC. So the first peril ARC started working with was drought. And you were asking what is index-based insurance. ARC help governments, of course, to build their own capacities in terms of risk profiling. That means understanding the nature of the peril, if it is drought or flood, and how it has been affecting the countries in the last 40 years since we have satellites. And based on that, make extrapolation and projects in the future what may happen, particularly taking into consideration the change in climate. And the index is a figure that aggregates a combination of informations around rainfall, for example, population, poverty, etc., which in case there is a peril, an event, and the aggregation of those data regarding that perils goes above a certain figure, an index, then it triggers. Okay, so you have index for each peril for each country, and then it says, for my country, if my index is 5, and then there is a hurricane, and the hurricane, or there is a flood, and that flood goes above 5, then it triggers, then the insurance can pay. If it is below, it doesn't pay. I don't know if I could explain. Okay, so it is rough, it's more complex than that, but I'm just trying to make it rough. So, and in doing its preliminary studies, you know, what was found was that, yes, the international community is very helpful, and they have been trying to support the continent, Africa, anytime there is a humanitarian event, and putting a lot of resources. But there is still a gap. It's never enough, and unfortunately, like all of you know, it doesn't come on time. If you see the big effort like the Red Cross is doing now in early financing, you know, it's exactly because of that. Because the system as it is today is not fast enough and is not just enough in terms of magnitude, no enough resources. So there has been a lot of work in ARC since 5 years, as we have already 33 member states that are working with us and 20 that are really into programs, and about 8 that have taken already insurance. So we have learned a lot of things. We have learned that, number one, index insurance can be a very good solution in closing that gap, financing gap we are talking about. Again, it's not to replace humanitarian assistance, but it's to close the gap and make it even, I will say, more effective. How? Okay, if there is an event, you take $1, you support people to buy $1 of, let's say, a bag of rice. If you use insurance, you take that dollar, you put it in insurance, there is a multiplying effect that dollar becomes 5 or 10 if there is a payout, depending on the magnitude. The insurance, very simple. So instead of just keeping your money and waiting, then when there is an event, I go and buy a bag of rice. If I take it and put it in the insurance, and there is a payout, I can have $5 and I can buy 5 bags of rice. That's number one. Second multiplying effect. If I am prepared enough, and this is demonstrated also by the studies of even Red Cross and many others, if I am prepared, I'm organized, and there is an event, and I use my dollar early enough at the beginning, I save $4 to $15, $20 3 months down the road. Usually we know that humanitarian resources come 3 months, 6 months down the road. Okay? Finally, because I have this multiplying effect, because I come early, it means that where I needed $4 in the past, I will need only $1. So it seems simple, but it is logical. We have done after action reviews, and we have concluded that it is much cheaper to do this. Second aspect, today we have a lot of humanitarian actors on the ground. They are there, they have little resources at the beginning. By the time the appeals are done and the resources come, NGOs and others are trying to do what they can without enough resources. So the suggestion is, why don't we give also, we will put these NGOs through the insurance scheme. Example, Senegal this year is going to have an insurance, and the Stark Group is going to have the equivalent insurance. Thank thanks to the government of Germany, who is paying the premium, and I'll come to the premium later, who is paying the premium, then it means, with the help of the government of Germany, Stark is going to have an insurance in parallel with the government of Senegal. And when there is a payout, Stark is on the ground with other NGOs, and Stark will be able, day one, to act, because it will get a payout. That payout will be used to also, have its intervention.
Sorry,
and then
Stark?
finally,
What's Stark?
Stark is a consortium of NGOs
It's an
that work in
acronym.
the humanitarian sector.
Senegalese.
No, international.
International. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
International. So finally, because they have resources early enough and they are present on the ground, when the humanitarian resources come 3 months later, they are already there. So they are already working, and it will be just a continuum. So it's just to say, while I want to insist on this, index insurance is not the panacea. Index insurance can reduce costs of humanitarian intervention, can help for preparedness, because it is linked to money. So therefore, you have to prepare, you have to have a contingency plan, and you have to be there in order to intervene early. It means you have to help build capacities locally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will actually be able to talk to the donor that you in question, Germany, in a moment when we open the floor to questions. But I just wanted to ask the others. I wanted to bring it sort of full circle, because we've gone from sort of one aspect of leaving no one behind to really quite an esoteric financial instrument. It seems kind of esoteric to me, just as a layman, and and also just as an ordinary person. Insurance salesmen ring me and ask me to give them premiums. I always feel a bit sort of suspicious. So I just wanted to know what you would think with the Red Cross. It's an enormous player in this. Whether you think that this is something that could work. Perhaps you guys as well, Carrie-Anne and Alexandra, would like to comment.
Thank you very much. I would like to build on Mohamed's points on the importance of investing before a disaster. And I think that is the whole spirit of insurance. It is how do you manage the risk and how to reduce the risk. And all the studies have shown indeed that $1 invested can lead you to up to $16 or $20 saving. And in the same spirit, we also had what we call forecast-based financing. Because we, working with the World Meteorological Organization, we get data that can predict with a level of precision that is quite unprecedented in any given season of a monsoon or of a cyclone, the places that are most vulnerable where they will be hitting. Now, it is then with that knowledge, one can prepare better, if one wishes to do so, in pre-positioning supplies, pre-positioning financing, making sure also we do the needful before the shock and hazard happen, in order, to identify those most vulnerable. And maybe the German colleagues will also touch on that, because together with the, German Red Cross and the support of the German government, that is also one of the innovative approaches in financing. And that is touching on a very important elements, that also call on the type of partnerships, that are required between government, humanitarian organizations, and communities in better understanding the risks that they're facing and what are the different means, through which, one can invest early enough to prevent those hazards from becoming the disasters that we see.
I'd like to jump in here and say this. The idea of the index-based insurance and so on, that has not reached my part of the world as yet. But What I can tell you, you made an interesting comment just now when you said when insurance salesmen call you, you get a little suspicious. When we're talking about persons with disabilities and the elderly who often don't have disposable income in the first place, telling them to pay $2, $5, $10 is almost an impossibility often for many persons. And it needs to be, as I keep stressing, and I can't stress this enough, a process of re-educating people to the importance of it. Because I agree, as I said, preparedness is a large part of the job that we need to undertake. But if people are not understanding properly that this money is not just going and sitting somewhere, it is there because we are vulnerable, we do, and we don't have many options. So I think sometimes the language that we use and the approach that we use does not come down to the everyday person. It doesn't resonate with the individual, and that is what we have to do if we're going to make these things work. So when a gentleman, like for example, at home in Barbados, if you are blind or deaf, you receive a non-contributory pension of less than $350 a month. And if you receive that, and then you're told, well, if you give me back 5 of that, in the event of a disaster, we'll have something in place to assist you. That already can't go far enough. So as we say in the Caribbean, we take a chance. And then when the disaster strikes, then we're caught with left behind. So it's also a process of education, I think.
If Alexandra and then Nella.
Okay. Quizás este tema sigue teniendo una serie de complejidades. En el Ecuador, por ejemplo, estamos saliendo ya de la época lluviosa de nuestro invierno y de forma muy preliminar tenemos un costeo que es bastante alto para el país. Eso ha significado, por ejemplo, que en las pérdidas agrícolas identifiquemos que no todos los sectores campesinos, que no todos los agricultores tienen un seguro agrícola, que es un programa que está siendo implementado por el Ministerio de Agricultura, pero al cual el acceso de los sectores campesinos es mínimo. Entonces, culturalmente, no está en su construcción ni en su cotidianidad pensar en qué tiene que asegurar sus cosechas. Y en este año hemos tenido aproximadamente 65,000 hectáreas de pérdidas agrícolas. Entonces, son cifras muy grandes que para el país son altamente significativas y que nos obligan a repensar entonces en políticas mucho más estructurales para que podamos sostener de alguna manera todo este manejo de recursos. Ustedes coincidirán conmigo en que sobre todo en los países de América Latina, seguramente no contamos con los recursos suficientes, tanto desde el Estado como también los recursos de nuestras familias, de nuestros ciudadanos, para sostener todo lo que año a año se va perdiendo por las distintas épocas, sea por sequía, sea por época lluviosa. Hay una serie de pérdidas que se dan en cada una de estas épocas. Por tanto, hablar de los seguros sin duda es importantísimo, pero también está atravesado por un tema cultural. Y por otro lado, obviamente todo lo que podamos hacer en gestión prospectiva del riesgo permite disminuir, mitigar, y en este caso para nosotros la acción de los gobiernos locales es fundamental. Hoy tenemos ya nuevas autoridades en gobiernos locales, hemos hecho un trabajo de poder sentarnos con cada una de ellas, de poder discutir sobre la necesidad de asumir medidas y políticas estructurales en su territorio para poder mitigar y reducir el riesgo frente a lo que ha significado momentáneamente esta época lluviosa, pero a todo lo que significa también en cada territorio las amenazas que tienen cada uno de ellos y frente a eso responder. No hay recursos específicos desde el Estado central para soportar todo lo que el país puede ir perdiendo y en ese caso hay que abrir el debate sobre los seguros por índices.
Thank you very much. I mean, there's a sense in which we all feel, and this is a unique opportunity at the GPDRR, you know, to look at innovative ways of financing, because, you know, we're all the aid agencies, governments, they're stretched when it comes to financing. And so we are, you know, inevitably going to be having to look at new things which are sort of implicitly a bit suspicious, might cause suspicion amongst people. Listen, we're running a bit short, so Nella, I know Nella, but both Nella and Mohammed want to say something. Please, can you just keep it to a minute? Is that going to be possible? And then, because then we need to open up to the audience.
Yes, just wanted to clarify, the fact that it's index-based doesn't mean that if the event occurs, that you are going to receive a payout all the time. And this can be challenging. So I just wanted also to clarify that you said 9 million for Kenya doesn't seem too much. The problem is that it is difficult to justify 9 million every year when you don't receive a payout. And it's not that because you buy an insurance that you're going to receive a payout if the event occurs. The event has to be strong enough to surpass a specific threshold. And these can be very challenging for justifying budgeting as well. But beyond these clarifications, I was also asked to reflect on 2 roles for the public sector, that what the public sector should do. And the 2 things are very related to what my colleagues have also been saying. The first one is that we need to act upon, and I repeat, act upon the fact that for index-based insurance and any other policy instrument or financial instrument to react after a disaster, for them to be successful, the only way is to work on DRR. All these instruments need to be anchored within a wider, strong national and subnational disaster risk reduction management system, including social protection programs, for example, in particular, if the aim is to protect the most vulnerable. And the second thing that I was thinking of for the public sector is that the public sector really needs to ensure, and this is very aligned with what we said before, sufficient, timely, and accurate information to reach those people at risk. Because of the high cost of including dispersed population, 2 main strategies have been used to ensure that there's enough critical mass to use these kind of mechanisms that can be a little bit complicated to grasp. However, the strategies have been to work with aggregators, that includes the state, but also to make the insurance schemes mandatory. However, in these processes, it is possible that the ultimate beneficiaries are not informed appropriately about how this type of insurance works, and what they're paying for, and how is it going to work, when are they going to receive a payout or not. This is very important. And especially when what we want as a community is to contribute to people's ability to take decisions to reduce their own risk. They're not going to do that if they don't understand what they're paying for, what they're using the money for, how this thing works. This is not a minimal issue. It's critical. So I see this as a public role because the feature that makes actually index-based insurance so attractive is that it reduces costs because it doesn't require household-level assessment. So there's not a real incentive that is based on the market that requires household-by-household data and analysis in that detail. So this is something that really the public sector needs to emphasize. That's it.
Thank you very much. It was longer than a minute.
Oh,
just
sorry.
Mohammed, 1 minute.
You. Okay, let's try. Okay, we are talking about no one left behind, right? You have 60% of the people, at least on the African continent, that just can't protect themselves. You need someone to come in. That's why we speak about sovereign responses, including sovereign insurance. So that's number 1. It's clear that you have to work on risk reduction. You have to work on adaptation. Climate is changing, we have to adapt. But climate is still striking. You know, you cannot stop hurricanes, you cannot stop drought, you cannot stop flood. So what do? We have to work on public policies with appropriate and realistic responses. The proposal here is use donor money, develop capacities at national level, leverage national budget, and have a multiplying effect by innovative financing. Insurance, green bonds, go for it. You cannot wait just that I don't have enough money, it's not there. 18 billion or something about that is what is used for humanitarian support today, assistance in
around the world.
There is still, is more. So it is still, there is still a huge gap, 1/3 missing. So we want to use private sector. You cannot use private sector without using market approaches. So we want a combination. It is government responsibility to develop policies. What is asked to the international community is to prime the pump, help them to go through so good policies are developed. $1 per ticket, $1 in lotto, I don't know what it is, but at a point, we can't always sit just and ask for handouts. People have to be innovative and respond with the right policies. That is the suggestion.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I can feel there's a bit of twitchiness going on in the audience and a bit of like closing of eyes. So it's time to move on. Thank you. I'm afraid. Well, let's, first of all, we are going to look at the questions that we've got. Can I just ask for that to come up? The top vote was actually for donors, so I thought that this was a good one to put to you, actually, Thomas, if that's all right. Do you see it? Where is it? Yes. What should donors do differently to leave no one behind? And everyone, can I introduce you to Mr. Thomas Helfen? He's Head of Division of Peace and Security Disaster Risk Management at the BMZ. That's the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development for the Government of Germany. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica, very much for giving me the word. Distinguished panelists, dear colleagues, the German government strongly commits itself to the principle of leaving no one behind. This is why we support communities in general and civil society organizations in particular. They have a sense of their own power to build resilience against disasters, and they have a specific understanding of local needs and give a voice to marginalized people. Local communities do not want DRR just for the people. They want DRR to be designed and implemented with the local people and by the local people. As an international community and as donors, we must ensure to go the last mile and reach those who are most in need. To leave no one behind is a guiding principle of humanitarian assistance and development cooperation. We have to target our attention to where the needs are most urgent. I fully associate myself with the esteemed representatives of IFRC and ARC. Indeed, we must get faster in making funds available to help in disaster situations. This is why we support forecast-based financing tools and risk financing tools to improve preparedness capacities. The German government has pledged 115 million euros for the Global Risk Financing Facility, and we want to make a key contribution to the implementation of the Insurance Resilience Global Partnership. Please allow me to point to another key issue. I would like to highlight the impact that fragility, conflict, and violence have on disaster risk reduction. The numbers are very impressive, even scaring. More than half of all deaths from natural hazard-related disasters occur in the world's 30 most fragile states. And this affects more than 1 billion people. And the trend is rising due to stress factors such as climate change, population growth, and resource depletion. without really boldly addressing the challenges posed by fragility, conflict and violence, we will not be able to achieve the Sendai framework. And it is at the local level that we can make the difference by empowering local communities and by building on the existing human capital. To make DRR programs in FCV context successful, we need new partnerships, we need collaboration, and we need political backing. We strongly advocate for strong language in the chair's summary of this year's global platform. And in this regard, dear delegates, we hope for your support regarding highlighting the nexus between FCV and DRR and in underlining the importance of community-based approaches. Germany has supported the elaboration and the printing of the cookbook edited by GNDR, the global network of over 900 civil society organizations for disaster risk reduction worldwide. So the recipes and the local knowledge are there and available. Let us join forces to support them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas Helfen. May I turn now to a representative from Help Age. Deepak Malik is Regional Program Manager for Disaster Risk Reduction and Humanitarian Response of Help Age International. Perhaps you could help us with the CSO perspective on what we've been talking about.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Veronica, for giving me the time. So one of the questions was who is really left behind? And I have the placard in front of me, aging older persons. And I think I am also aging. Every person here is aging. We all want to age, first of all, healthy and active. So it is about active aging. It is about healthy aging. And there are already declarations, universal commitments to leave no one behind. However, older people are still left behind. One of the researches I just want to quote in, I think I have just 2 minutes, yes? So one of the things which I wanted to highlight is that we recently did a study, and we reviewed more than 200 documents, and it was very striking that only 38% of those documents, which were mainly assessments, had any mention of older people, And out of those, even 38%, only 2% had any recommendation on any specific targeted intervention for older people. Only 1% of the amount of money which goes into humanitarian funding is targeted for older people, based on our researches. So yes, I can surely say from our assessments that yes, older people are left behind. Overall, what I want to say is that there is a need for, first of all, recognition of older people and their needs. And that can be done only if we recognize them in the assessments. In the assessments post-disasters, and also in disaster risk reduction interventions. One is about data collection, but it is also about analysis of that data. So yes, there are agencies which have started talking about collection of data which is based on age cohorts, but then what happens is that that data is not analyzed based on age, and which does not result to supporting them. So yes, we as HelpAge are committed to work with and for older people, and we request the other agencies also to help them out with your support, and we'll be willing to support if there is any technical support required from HelpAge. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. We've actually pretty much run out of time. There are a couple of comments that I'm going to read because They're important insights. But there's one last question that I think would be quite good to put to people. First of all, I don't know if you can see on the screens there in front of you, in the question of who should be responsible for leaving no one behind, we should have had an option for we all should be responsible. Okay, we've had a cheer of support for that. Have we got that? Can we show that, Gael, the pie chart, and see whether that's changed, by the way? Sorry, this is a technical, I don't know if that's possible. Is it, Nick? Okay, we should be able to show that in a few minutes. Aha, there we go. Oh, it has changed significantly. Donors are apparently less responsible and governments even more responsible than they were before. Let's keep this, can we keep this going through to the end of the conference, to the 17th? It'd be quite interesting just to check on it every so often to see what happens and how people's views on inclusivity get included. Do we think that, I'm sorry, moving back to the questions that we've got, do we think that a framework is necessary to measure the localization commitment and support local government to take action to leave no one behind? Don't know how one would design that. When will government and donors adopt an inclusive and right-based approach for DRR and resilience planning and actions? Policy domains are still the domain of men and powerful, and they tend to ignore weak and voiceless, hence the risk for them is increasing. We need some answers from experts in this panel. The what and why are clear, however, the how is still a grey area. I would like to make a suggestion on the how. Okay. There are many other questions. I'm really grateful to everybody who put in a question. Obviously, I can't get them all answered, but I am going to ask for a final comment from each of our distinguished panelists. And if they want to pick up on the themes that have been given by the audience, that would be most appreciated, not least by the person who asked it, I'm sure. So would that be okay? 2 questions each. And may I start with Mohammed and work our way the other way round? Is that all right? Thank you, Mohammed. 2 minutes.
Even less. I think the increase of disasters due to climate and other political unrests are unfortunately increasing. They are increasing, particularly climate disasters are increasing both in frequency and in magnitude. So it means that we will need more resources, we will need more innovative solutions. There is no one size that fits all. The responsibility, as shown by people here, is first to the government, to the people themselves, to the communities. And communities don't wait, actually. They are doing their own share, and the government should do more. And we believe that we need multitude of solutions depending on the layer on which we are. And the issue is so big that we'll need very serious partnership building. In front of us, we have a task. Alone, none of us can resolve it. It needs massive partnership, both at international level, but also at national level.
Thank you very much. Nella?
I wanted to reply to the question about non-human priority. And I think that in general, in terms of DRR, we need to be very conscious that humans, we do not live on our own. Like, we live in an ecosystem. And that means that if we really want to manage risk, we need to address both at the same time. We need to address the risks of humans living within an ecosystem that supports us. So that is really important in terms of DRR.
Thank you. Carrie-Anne?
I'd like to address the question of how. How is, and actually it's related back to the pie chart, all of us are responsible. So each of us needs to work together in order to sort out the how. The how is going to depend on the country, it's going to depend on the communities. That's why I'm a bit concerned that the communities number is so low, because it's those that live in the communities that know best what is affecting them and what their challenges are likely to be. And so the how cannot be affected unless there is full participation by all parties concerned. So that would be my answer to the how.
Thank you.
Creo que la mirada cambia cuando asumimos que las personas con las que debemos trabajar son los protagonistas. A veces los miramos desde el ser víctimas, cuando son los protagonistas de el cambio y la transformación de las políticas públicas, de las dinámicas sociales. Por tanto, la acción de los gobiernos, tanto del nacional como del local, tiene que ver con entender esas dinámicas que nos plantean a diario los protagonistas, los adultos mayores, las mujeres, los niños, niñas y adolescentes, las personas con discapacidad. Cuando todos estos elementos están mirados en un contexto mucho más integral, seguramente vamos a poder ir respondiendo a las necesidades que tienen cada uno de estos sectores.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Secretary General.
Thank you very much. Let me first support Nella's point about living in an ecosystem, and that answers also the question about animals, because it's about human lives, it's also about livestock. But when we are in a disaster scene, also every member of the ecosystem is also running for safety. So snakes are running for safety in the same way the humans are. And it is not rare that we see much casualties, be caused by snake bites, in the middle of that. So thinking of also prepositioning antivenom as also part of, good preparedness, just to give an example, which is not a nice one, but it is a reality that we face. Now, on the question of who's responsible, we all talk about communities and we focus on communities. We really would not stress enough how important it is to invest in local actors and also to have a community-led approaches in all these responses. However, it will be totally irresponsible to shift the whole burden to the shoulders of the communities alone. So governments have a role to play, and then they should be held accountable. And the key word here is accountability. Many promises made by governments, many promises broken. And no consequences whatsoever. And that's also the reason why it is extremely difficult to build a trust with the communities. And the reactions to those lack of trust turn to be now problems that we face in also our humanitarian response and development response. Unfortunately, in places where we work, there's often no doctor where the needs are greatest. In those places we work, there's often no school when there are many children and they need to be taught. In those places, there are often even not a government structure, yet there are citizens, who have rights and an obligation that needs to be cared for. And then I would call and then join, those who call for partnership, like Mohammed, that is about, partnership between the communities, and the government. It is also a partnership between the rich and the poor, in the rural settings and then the urban. And at the international level, that we make sure that those that are hardest to reach and most vulnerable will not be the last in the response, but really the first in the response. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Secretary General. And thank you very much to all of our panelists, to you, our audience, for contributing in the questions and in the poll and for listening, hearing us out. Thank you to the technical team. Thank you to the signing team. I really appreciate everybody's participation. Good luck with the rest of the conference. The people in disaster areas need us. Goodbye.